Okay, welcome everyone to another session of a random walk down Mill Street. Today's topic is accompanying the Torah. So if you haven't realized what we're going to be discussing, we're going to be talking about aspects of the Torah service, the procession of the Torah service, and it's not going to be in very great detail, or at least some parts might be, but won't be overly detailed in the grand scheme of things. So I think we'll be probably at a half an hour approximately. So let me share my screen and let's make sure that we are from the beginning here. Okay. Can someone just let me know by thumbs up if you can hear me and see my screen? Excellent. Great. Thank you. Okay. So as I said, today's topic is accompanying the Torah. And the placement of this is with the Torah service. And it could be talking about different kinds of services, but right now I'm going to concentrate just on Shabbat morning. And so on Shabbat morning, when we finish the Shachrit, we have several things that take place before we read the Torah. And the very first thing that we do here in Sheretz Israel is we pray for the government. Some synagogues, including London, do that later on in the service. They do it after the Haftarah, but we do it here. I like how the note here in the Hebrew does not perfectly match. It's a Berov Kehilot, which means in most congregations, whereas here it isn't many. But anyway, the idea is that some congregations, like ours, pray for government after Shachrit, before we take out the Torah. Some do it after the reading of the Torah, after the Haftarah, before Musaf. And then after that, something that we no longer do here, except on consecration Shabbatot, is Hashkabot, memorial prayers. Used to be that every single Shabbat, after the prayer for the government, before taking out the Torah, memorial prayers would be read. In particular, what's called the Perpetual Hashkappalas. Those who are on this list have been put on the list by the Parnasse, by the board of trustees. They get their on the week of their anniversary, the Shabbat following their anniversary, then their nachala, their names are read in a communal hashkabas, one for the men, one for the women. We no longer do that, except for consecration Shabbatot, and we will recite the names of those who are on the perpetual list for that specific synagogue that's being commemorated. And then following that, the Parnasse will walk up to the Teba to distribute the mitzvot. While he's walking up, the choir sings the Misha Barach for the Kahal. Obviously in the summer, it's just recited by the Chazan in the same nusach as all the other Misha Barach. But while in season, when the choir sings it, there are several melodies that are used. One is the Rossi Melody, which we have been doing every single week for the last couple of years, or last year or so. So I thought for today, I'd remind you of what the other melody was, which is the other melody was written by our choir master, Leon Kramer. There's actually a third melody, which is written by Leon Hyman, which I won't play for you either tonight. All three of these are really quite nice. I chose this one just because we haven't heard it in a while in the synagogue. Hear it? So we listened to that whole piece. It's you have to imagine yourself in the synagogue. Those of you who have seen it will readily remember. This is the time when the shamash is running around, making sure that all the mitzvot are filled and accounted for, and that he knows all the names, so that I can feed them to the Parnasse and the Chazan, who will announce them to the congregation with a little, there's a little, we're going to listen to it, as well as a bow to each person, announcing who has which honor for the Torah service. So that is all that happens right before we read the Torah. Next, the Parnasse. Now, today in Sheretz Israel, and it's been this way for a long time, other than the high holidays, and occasionally when the Parnasse has a particular prerogative, usually we'll leave the assigning of the mitzvot to the shamash, who knows who can do what job and is good at what position when looking around the room. Now on the holidays that changes, where I submit a list to the Parnasse. The Parnasse goes through each one and determines who should be invited for each job. Usually many people have a chazakah, they've done it years in a row, but those that are open will be selected by the Parnasse in particular. But that's not the way it always was. It used to be that the Parnasse would decide on the spot who would do which honor. And this is the way it's still done in many congregations, including our sister synagogue, Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, where the Parnasse will go up and they'll confer. And there's no choir there, so there's not like there's this music going on in the background. They're just sitting there, Chazan and the Parnasse, looking around the room. Oh, this guy, that guy, he can carry, he can open the Heichal. And then when they got it all set, then they'll announce it. And that is what we're going to look at next. I don't know what they do in Amsterdam or London, meaning whether they whether the Parnasse will confer with the Chazan on the spot, or whether they have assigned it ahead of time. My guess is for the holidays they've assigned them all ahead of time, and on each Shabbat might be a little bit more fast and loose based on who's in synagogue. Anyway, I just wanted to show you the Constitution, or a little bits of Article 5 from the Constitution. Tells you that electors of the congregation, which essentially is a level of membership, have the preference to be called to the Sefer Torah and entitled to all the mitzvot. But should any stranger attend the place of worship, the acting Parnasse shall be at liberty to call him to the Sefer Torah and give him any other mitzvah as he may deem proper. So there is a lot. This comes in a whole long list of who is entitled to what mitzvah, who can be called to the Torah, on what occasion you're entitled to be called to the Torah. And so this is part of that list of saying that, generally speaking, members have more precedence over visitors, but the Parnasse is at liberty to give out whoever he wants to these mitzvot. And just interestingly enough, and maybe people should, this is part of the Constitution, so this is the rules of the day, if anyone wants to take note of this. An elector, when married or on the marriage of a son, shall have the distribution of all the mitzvot on the ensuing Shabbat. So all the mitzvot, meaning the kibudim of that Torah service, are assigned by either the Chatan or the Chatan's father on the Shabbat following the wedding. Similarly, on section 4, an elector having a son shall be entitled to all the aforesaid rights above, with the exceptions stated, on the Shabbat preceding the Brit. So the Baal HaBrit can assign all the mitzvot on the Shabbat before the Brit, and the Chatan, or the father of the Chatan, can assign all of the mitzvot on the Shabbat following the wedding. And then there is another section which I didn't copy for you. It says, if there are multiple honors that are competing with each other, the Parnasse will decide who gives which mitzvah to whom. So the Parnasse has ultimate discretion, but there are times when the Parnasse is not the one assigning the mitzvot. And I wonder if on those occasions, perhaps instead of the Parnasse walking up during that song, perhaps the Baal HaBrit should be walking up, or perhaps the Chatan should be walking up to assign those mitzvot on those occasions. Today we do it all in advance and we have it in the list. But anyway, here is the formula that we use here in Sheretz Israel to announce the mitzvot. And these are the individual jobs. And he has it in English and in Hebrew, Sheyiftach et sha'arei ha'eichal, to open the doors of the ark. Sheyotzi sefer Torah, to take out the Torah, to carry the Torah scroll. Sheye'echoz etz chaim, which literally means to hold the handles of the Torah, the atzei chaim, which he writes as to remove the bells. Sheyiglol sefer haTorah, to wrap the Torah, that we call it the band. Sheyagbia sefer Torah, to elevate it before the congregation, which also known as levantar. And Sheyilaveh et sefer haTorah, which is to accompany the Torah, which is the thing that we're going to talk about today. Now, there is this is the formula we have used since about 1789. Prior to the American Revolution, these mitzvot would have been announced in Portuguese, as is done to this day in Amsterdam and in London, which we will actually soon listen to. But after the American Revolution, Gershom Mendy Seixas was in Philadelphia, and with the returning Parnassim to New York and the reorganization of the New York community, they invited Gershom Mendy Seixas to come back. And he said, okay, provided you give me a better salary than I had before, and had a few other stipulations, one of which was no more Portuguese. We're going to use English or Hebrew. We're not going to use Portuguese. And so since that time, the mitzvot have been announced in Hebrew here at Sheretz Israel. But nevertheless, here we are, several hundred years later. Even though it is not used liturgically, we still refer to levantar and Accompanion, a few other words like that. Even though we have not used them liturgically for literally hundreds of years, still it's called that. And in fact, I was looking for an example to show you, but before the holidays, used to be we did it before Pesach and Shavuot and Sukkot. Now we mainly do it before the high holidays, and now we do it electronically. But it was nicer than the old days. A card would be sent out inviting people to do the mitzvot of the Torah service, which was signed by the Parnasse, and you would receive it a week or two or three before the holiday, and those terms are still used to levantar the sefer, to serve as a companion, even though we don't use them when we announce it. Anyway, I thought it'd be fun. If you've been to synagogue lately, you've heard this every single week. If you haven't been to synagogue lately, you might get a kick out of hearing Bram Cardozo make these announcements.
מי שברך אבותינו יברך את, and then the name, שיפתח את שעריך ברוך הוא לאדוני. מי שברך אבותינו יברך את, שיוציא ספר התורה ברוך הוא לאדוני. מי שברך אבותינו יברך, שיחוז עץ חיים של ספר התורה ברוך הוא לאדוני. מי שברך אבותינו יברך, שיגלול ספר התורה ברוך הוא לאדוני. מי שברך אבותינו יברך, שיגביה ספר התורה ברוך הוא לאדוני. מי שברך אבותינו יברך, שילווה את ספר התורה ברוך הוא לאדוני. כהניך ילבשו צדק, וחסידיך ירננו, בגבור דוד עבדך, אל תשב פני משיחך.
And that is the formula and the melody that we follow when we announce the mitzvot. And when you say kohanecha, all sorts of things start moving. People start going to the Torah to open the Eichal and take out the Torah, etc., etc. So I want to talk about the Accompanion today. What is accompanying the Torah? Where does it come from? What is that function actually? What do they do? Now, I tried pretty hard to find videos. They don't exist. Not from our congregation, not from other congregations. It's really, really hard. And I think that even now in the pandemic times, when people are putting more things online, there's almost nothing of a live Torah service. Now, I can tell you that for our congregation, the reason is pretty simple, is we don't permit photography during services. It's considered distracting, and we don't want to get in the way of actual prayers, so we don't permit photography during live services. So there are, however, some staged photographs which I found useful, and a few surreptitious photographs that people have taken and posted in certain places. So we'll show you some of those now. Oh, whoops, that's the wrong thing.
Me.
I skipped ahead. I skipped too far ahead. Sorry. Double back. So I mentioned that in our congregation we say them in Hebrew, but in Amsterdam and in London, to this day, they announce these mitzvot in Portuguese. Do they speak Portuguese in everyday life? No. But they are still announcing the mitzvot in Portuguese. Presumably, at one point in time, perhaps in the 17th century, maybe even into the 18th century, probably not in the 19th century, there were people who natively spoke Portuguese, and it would have been useful to know, they might recognize their name in Hebrew, but they might not know which job they were assigned unless it was said to them in Portuguese. So presumably that's why this developed in this fashion. But I don't really know. But it persists in London and in Amsterdam today. And the book on the left here, this is the new Amsterdam prayer book that was put out by Koren a few, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. And it has the language here, Ke abrira aportas do hechal, to open the hechal, the doors of the hechal. And here you see the same language in London. This is the New London book, which says Ke abrira as portas do hechal. Now they are essentially identical in the language used, with some very small differences that I wish I could ask Herman Solomon about the correctness of. Sadly, he's not around to answer. But so, for example, you might see some of the spellings. So it says Kefara etz chaim ao ao, whereas in the British book it'll say Kefara. It says this is etz chaim, heshaim, etz chaim, do sefer Torah. It's a little different. Ao do. I don't know the technical specifics and which one is more accurate or not, but these are the little things that have fallen into their usages. So we listen to one. I have recordings of both, the Dutch and the British. They're pretty similar. Let's listen to the British one. This is Chazon Ben Arosh.
מי שברך אבותינו הוא יברך פלוני בן פלוני כאברירה אז פורטס דו היכל ואת פלוני בן פלוני כלברא או ספר תורה ואת פלוני בן פלוני que acompañará o sefer Torah vet ha-bachur peloni ben peloni que fará et chayim do sefer Torah ואת הבחור פלוני בן פלוני כזן פשרה או ספר תורה ואת הגביר פלוני בן פלוני כלבנתרה או ספר תורה ברוכים הם לאדוני.
So you get a sense, it's essentially the same thing as we do here. One thing that we do a little differently that I tend to like is that each name gets Baruch Hu L'Adonai, and then it goes and each one gets their own Mishvarach. Mishvarach Avotenu Yivarech. Whereas in the London and in the Amsterdam version, they're just collectively done. Make Mishvarach, and then it's Ve'et, Ve'et, Ve'et. And then at the end, they get Beruchim Heim L'Adonai. Okay, not that much of a difference. Now, there is one significant difference that we're going to talk about a little later, and that is the order. So, Amsterdam, like New York, has opening the Heichal first, carrying the Sefer, holding on to the Eitz Chaim, the bells, wrapping the band, accompanying the Torah, and Levantar. Actually, we do Levantar and then Accompanion at the end. It's a slightly different order. In London, however, they do opening the Heichal. That's the same. Carrying the Sefer, that's the same. Here, this is just carrying first, second, or third Sefer. Then they put Accompanion right there. And then they have the bells and the band and the Levantar, which we're going to talk about that a little bit later. The order of these blessings and what that means, what that indicates. Okay, now I promised you before that we would look at some pictures. So let's take a look at some pictures. Here on the left, this is one of those non-sanctioned photographs that was taken during a live service. It was Hoshana Rabbah. You see people who have their lulabim, and this is for the taking out of the Sifrei Torah for Hoshanganot, not for reading of the Torah, but for Hoshanganot. But there is an Accompanion, and this is just to show you what the Accompanion does. There is the Chazan here, then there is the Parnasse. In this case, this is Rabbi Rode. This is Avery Newmark, was Sagan Hayom that day. And I don't know who this was, but this is the Accompanion on that morning, on that Hoshana Rabbah morning. And so there is someone assigned to accompany the Sifrei Torah every time you take out the Torah, whether you're reading from it or whether you're taking it out for another purpose, like Hoshanganot or Hakafot, I guess, as well. And what is the function of the Accompanion? We're going to talk a little bit about that. The Accompanion follows and accompanies the Sifrei Torah. Torah will walk, and then the Chazan, then the Parnasse, and then the Accompanion will walk as well. When they get to the Teba, the Torah goes up the Torah to Teba to get undressed. Parnasse will walk around to his corner, and if you can see here, this is the Accompanion comes up on the other corner. This is what we do here in New York. Not the same in all the other communities. By the way, if you look at this photograph, there is something quite amazing and kind of shocking, and that is, in this photograph, which comes from 1948, I think 1949, there is a lamp, literally a lamp right here on the Teba. I don't know if you can see it here, but that is a lamp. So there should be no, I wonder what happened to it. I wonder if it was used on Shabbat. I don't know. Probably it was, because I remember the lighting in the synagogue was not as good as it is today. They added those spotlights a little later, maybe after this time. So maybe they needed it for the Chazan to be able to read. Don't know. If you know, let me know. But this is there was a lamp a desk lamp on the Teba in the 40s anyway, making it hard to see that this is the Accompanion standing there. So in Sheretz Israel, the Accompanion has a role to accompany the Torah. Then he has a role to help with the Levantar, with the lifting of the Torah. Now, we're going to talk about Levantar another day, but the Accompanion will come up, stand in the corner, and take the bells, which the boy has put on the Teba, and put it on top of the Torah, and assist with the Levantar. While the Levantar goes up, when he comes down, he takes the bell again, make sure that it goes on the proper stave over here on the side of the of this metal pole on the side here. And then the Accompanion has a very, very important job, which is to go and stand by the candlestick while we call the Kohen. And then he is supposed to stay there until the Kohen comes up, says his bracha for the Torah, and then he gets bowed to, and then he can go and sit down. Where does he sit down? Not in his own seat, but on the Teba, remaining there for the entire Torah service, and will accompany the Torah back to the Heichal at the end of the Torah service. That is the function of the Accompanion. And here is another picture from that same set in 1949. This, by the way, this is my grandfather, Judah Gedalia. This is Dr. Gerstein. I think these people were just, I don't know who they are. They were just there for the photograph. They're not people that I recognize, but this would be, in the order of things, the Parnasse and the Accompanion, returning the Sefer to the Heichal. And by the way, if you're looking carefully, here is that little lamp that I was so shocked by, right there on the top of the Teba. Okay. So that is the Accompanion right here, following the procession with the Torah in the Torah procession, accompanying the procession. If you are not sure you got all the details of what the Accompanion did just in the last slide or two that I explained, there are written instructions which I can give you, and I am going to show you right here. They have 16 different lines. Not to scare you off, but there are a lot of details in being the Accompanion, and we made sure that every single detail is accounted for in the instructions. We're not going to go through them now, don't worry, but basically tells you what I said. The Accompanion walks up, and he accompanies the Torah, he helps with the Levantar, he bows to the Kohen, sits on the Teba, and then accompanies everybody back to the Heichal. I was surprised to learn that this procedure is not the same in our sister synagogues in London and in Amsterdam, nor in other synagogues like in Buffo in Paris. And I'd like to hear from other ones. I think I'm going to start emailing our friends in Montreal and in Philadelphia and Livorno and Gibraltar to see what the Accompanion does there. Que levara, que abrira. So this is okay. So this is from Bucharest, which is probably. Oh, thank you, Dan. This is you're referring to basically what's done in Turkish synagogues or Ladino-speaking synagogues, where they bid. They have a little auction before taking out the Torah. This would have been in Spanish or Ladino, not in Portuguese. They don't have an Accompanion, I don't think. They have opening the Heichal. They have carrying the Torah. They don't have a Accompanion. But yes, they would bid for them. The winner would get assigned it, and they would use this similar language in that function. We here at Sheretz Israel, as well as in our sister synagogues, tend not to auction off these positions, but that is very common in other synagogues. Solomon will tell us about Amsterdam. We know we're going to get there very soon. So you'll see what I have prepared, and then you'll fill in all the holes. So thank you, Solomon. I'll let you. I'll ask you to unmute in a little bit. First, we're going to talk about London. So the instructions here come from New York, but here you can see the instructions as they are written in London. It comes from this book called The Mitzvot of the Spanish-Portuguese Jews Congregation in London, a guide for Parnasse. So this is basically if you're going to preside over services and make the assignments, you have to know what all the jobs are. And it describes what the job is. So for the accompagnar, which we call Accompanion, the accompagnar, it gives us it's a much more compact explanation. And we'll read it now, and we'll see what differences we can note. The gentleman who has this mitzvah leaves his seat, proceeds towards the ark, takes his stand at the left-hand side of the space before the ark. So that means he's left. On the left side. We have him on the right. Here in London, he's on the left. He remains there until the procession to the Teba sets out, when he takes his place behind the Sefer. Already that is a difference. We do not have the Accompanion walk behind the Sefer. We have the Chazan and the Parnasse, and then the Accompanion follows up in the rear. In London, the Sefer comes out first, and then the Accompagnar walks right behind it. On reaching the Teba, he remains standing until the Kohen or other person is called for the Sefer, completes the first blessing, he turns around and bows to the Accompagnador, who returns the bow, bows to the Parnasse, receives the bow, and takes a seat on the Teba. This is the same that we do here. A choreographic function to bow as needed. That's a very important job for the Accompagnanis to know how to bow. When the Sefer returns, he takes his place immediately after the Sefer, again, in front of the Chazan, stands to the left of the open space before the ark until the latter has been closed, and then he bows to the Parnasse and returns to his seat. So his placement is a little different, but essentially the same thing, except for the fact that he is right behind the Torah. And if you're accompanying the Torah, that's a good place to be. That's what is done in London. Now, in Amsterdam, and we're going to get there, Solomon, Amsterdam, it's a little different. Still, And I'm gonna unmute in a second, but let me just tell you what I found. So this comes from the Seder Chazanut, which is a wonderful website. I think it's put on by family Sundervan. Jaap Sundervan made this website for the community in Amsterdam, and he has a lot of great Chazanut and other minhagim and other things are written there. And just in passing, in describing what the Portuguese words are that they're used, when he talks about the accompagnador or the accompanion, he tells you this is the person who walks in front of the Sefer Torah and leads the way and holds the cloak. This is very different than what we are used to. The accompanion not bringing up the rear, but the accompanion walking in front of the Torah. We can't even imagine someone walking in front of the Torah here, and who holds the cloak. And now I'm going to ask Solomon if you can explain a little more about what this function is in Amsterdam.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. So when the announcement is made, first remark, it says que accompagnera dos sefarim of the
Well, that's when you
sefarim.
have two Torahs, right?
Yeah. So if you when there is multiple ones, or it's one is que accompagnera ao Sefer Torah. Of ao means of the, and do means the. That's the difference between the two, and it's translated, I guess, from the Dutch shrinking when you say of the, rather than only the, like in English. And he walks in front of the Sefer Torah or Sefarim and holds the cloth.
Explain. I don't have a good visual. What does that mean? He holds the cloth. What does that mean?
There is an opening in the front of the cloth.
On our Sefer Torah, we hold the opening towards the body of the Sefer.
Yeah, and in Amsterdam they don't. They hold it straight in front of them if they carry right. If people know what to do, and you hold it there. So, and then people who are standing in, only those people who are standing in the bench where the Sefer Torah goes to, you're not supposed to move. That's disorderly conduct to move in the synagogue, and very seriously punished by a request by the shamash to leave the synagogue. You cannot move in the synagogue to kiss the Sefer Torah. So only people standing there are able to put the tzitzit on the Sefer Torah, and the accompagnador takes care of that. And then he will walk on the teba with.
Wait, can you go slower? The accompagnador permits people who are in the path to kiss the Torah with their tzitzit?
Yes.
By holding out the cloak? So that they're kissing the cloak, not the actual Torah.
Correct.
I see.
And then he walks on the teba and helps undress. He takes the cloak of the Torah and puts it where it belongs, and the children take care of the rest. And then he stands at the same place where the person who had an aliyah, who
same as in New York and same as in London.
Yeah, but he doesn't stand on the because that's where the Chacham stands. On the left side, where the accompagnador stands in Shirat Israel, that's where the Chacham stands, and on the other side stands the Parnasse. So he goes immediately to that spot where somebody has to bow to him, the Kohen who is called for this, so that's the main. And by returning is the same thing. He walks in front of the Sifrei Torah, not.
Does he hold out? So he holds out the cloak again.
He holds out, and he does the same thing again during the if there is Hoshanganot. It's the same thing. During Hakafot, there is no custom because there are no Hakafot. That's made up in Shirat Israel. Very recently.
So thank you very much, Solomon. So the Accompagnion's function, in the major function, is to walk in front of the Torah and to hold out the cloak so that those who are in its path can kiss the cloak of the Torah as it passes. I have also been told by a witness who I asked about it earlier that on occasion, if it's a very tall Sefer carrier or a very tall Sefer Torah or a very tall Rimonim, they might have to move the lamp on the pillar so that the Torah does not bump into it. I don't know how frequent an occasion that is, but apparently that is a possibility. So the Accompanion is also making sure that no one is in the path other than themselves of the Torah as it goes to the Teba.
That's Yom Kippur. What you're talking about is Yom Kippur in the evening, when we take in Amsterdam out 14 Sefarim, Shabbat, Shabbaton, is the reason for that, and because the number of trustees. But and then there is little candles on the benches. We don't have electricity in Amsterdam, so there are little candles which are removed by the Shabbat Goy so that the coats of the Sefer Torah won't burn.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Solomon. Reverend Vasias, as you can tell, grew up in Amsterdam. He served as Shamash as well as Chazan there before coming here to New York and being Chazan and Shamash and helping with funerals as well as many other things here in New York City. So thank you for your expertise and your explanations. So now we see it. I thought it was interesting that there are these differences, perhaps small, but they are differences in what the function of the Accompanion is. In New York, the Accompanion walks behind and has this role with the Levantar and basically stays with the Torah while it's on the Teba, while it's moving. In London, that person is much closer to the Torah, literally walking immediately behind it, in front of the Chazan and anyone else, does not have a function during Levantar. And that is because, and I don't know if we'll ask Solomon also what they do in Amsterdam, but in London at least, they do not use the Rimonim that are on the Torah from the Heichal, that are carried with Torah for Levantar, because many of them are very heavy and they don't want to risk them falling or causing difficulty for the Levantador. So they have special Rimonim that are light, that are used just for Levantar, and we'll probably talk about that another week. And so the Accompanion doesn't have to have any function in the Levantar at all. He just has to stay with the Torah. And as we saw in Amsterdam, same in Amsterdam, they have special bells for the Levantar. And as we saw in Amsterdam, the Accompanion walks in front of the Torah, which is kind of shocking to me. I don't know if it's shocking to anyone else. And probably if you grew up with it, it's not shocking at all. But for me, it's shocking that someone would walk in front of the Torah. It seems like the exact thing that we're trying to avoid. But he walks in front of the Torah, holds out the cloak so that people can kiss it, and also, I guess, make sure that the path is clear. And that is the different roles of the Accompanion in the different communities. I was told by Dr. Peter Nachon of Switzerland, of Paris, that the custom in Buffo in Paris, the Portuguese synagogue in Paris, is similar to the one in London, where the Accompanion walks behind the Torah, but also that there can be more than one Accompanion. So as Mr. Vastias was telling us, Reverend Vastias was telling us, the Accompanion will be who accompanies one Sefer, the Sefer, or the Sefarim, as we have here also, Sifrei Torah, or however many Sefarim there are, there's one Accompanion. But in Paris, if there's two Sefarim, there are two Accompañeros. And if there's three, there are three. And they each stay with the Torah, kind of like a Sigan, or the Sigan on Simchat Torah, which literally is like an Accompanion for each Torah and each Chatan on Simchat Torah. So that is the custom in Paris. And he also told me another interesting fact. When they announced the mitzvot similar to what we do here, as well as in Amsterdam and London, but they do it in French. So I asked him what the formula was, and he said he'd have to get back to me with the exact language. But maybe we'll have to tune in for an update another week. Okay. The last thing I want to just tell you about is some of the halachic. So when it comes to Torah services, there is very, very few ancient sources. There are almost none, because all the customs of the Torah procession develop in the Middle Ages or the early modern period. Ruth Langer has an article about the development in Ashkenaz. She doesn't talk about Sepharad as much, but really talking about how what was very practical and utilitarian in ancient times or in antiquity becomes all about mimicking the giving of the Torah at Sinai in Ashkenaz, and so that has to do with some of the verses that are read and when they're read and when they're said, and imitating temple practices, imitating Sinai, and so I think a similar kind of aggrandizement occurs in Sepharad as well. But I just want to talk about what are the actual sources, and to compare that to what's actually done in our communities. So the place to start is actually the last of these sources, which is the Sultana Rule. I'm just going to read to you. This is the source that most people point to. It's based on halacha that's in Masechet Sota, but it says, "Ein hatzibor resha'im latzeit mibeit hakneses ad sheyatniu et sefer Torah." The community is not allowed to leave the synagogue until the Torah is put away. V'im matni'im hasefer Torah b'bayit acher, im ein lebeit hakneset ela petach echad tzrichim lehitakev ad sheyetzeh hasefer Torah ve'yelechu acharav lemkom shematni'in oto sham. So they say that if the Sefer Torah is not residing, is not put away in the synagogue, so that requires a little explanation. But in older period of time, there was no heichal, there was no cabinet or ark where the Torah was kept, but the Torah was kept in a side room or a different room outside of the synagogue itself. And so, if that's the case, by the time of the Shulchan Aruch, I think that most synagogues had arks, but he remembers from the sources that there were other customs. And he says, if that's the case, they're taking the Torah out, the people have to wait. They can't leave the Torah. They can't leave the synagogue until the Torah has left the synagogue. You know, have to wait till it leaves the building before they can leave. That's just a sign of respect. So in this case, it's talking about going after it. But it's also kind of talking temporally, meaning they don't put the Torah scroll away right away. They wait to the end of services because they're praying. At the end of services, when they put the Torah away, then people can leave the synagogue. They shouldn't leave while the Torah is out. And this is also the halacha as brought down in an earlier period by the Mishnah Torah, where he tells you, let's see here, let's talk about the Glila. Makom shemotziin sefer Torah achar shekor'in bo umolichin oto lebeit acher, in the places where they bring the Torah after the service is over, after the reading is over, to another room, put it away. Ein hatzibor resha'in latzeit ad sheyetzeh sefer Torah. The people are not allowed to leave until the Torah scroll goes away. Vilavu oto, they should accompany it. Vehem acharav, and they should follow afterwards. Ad hamakom shematni'in oto bo, until the place where they return the Torah to, they put it away. This is essentially the source for the yilaveh, for accompanying the Torah here in the Mishnah Torah. And it has to do with putting the Torah away. People should not leave until the Torah is away, and they should follow behind it. There is a parallel source, a different kind of source from Masechet Sofrim. Now, Masechet Sofrim is a little hard to date. It's post-Talmudic, but whether it was composed in the year 600, 700, 800, 900, 1000, 1100, we don't know. There are some indications that it's very old and from Babylonia, and other indications that it is newer and from Europe. One thing that is known for sure is that there are no copies of it found in the Cairo Geniza, which is interesting in terms of figuring out where its sphere of influence was or where it was authored and when. In any case, I'm going to skip through the whole top here. We don't need to read any of that. Go right to the bottom. Kach hayu nikiyei hadat shebYerushalayim osin. This is what the clean of mind in Jerusalem were accustomed to doing, and this means the people who were careful. Keshahayu motziin et haTorah umachzirin hayu holchin achareh mipnei kvoda. When they would take out and return the Torah, they would follow afterwards to give it honor, mipnei kvoda, because of the Torah's honor. And this is interesting because it mentions both returning and taking out the Torah, whereas all the other sources just talk about returning the Torah. People can't leave until the Torah goes back to its place. They don't talk about accompanying the Torah on its trip from the Heichal to the Teba. This is what the Masechet Sofrim does. Anyway, those are the sources of the custom, but I wanted to compare those sources to what we do. So in our synagogue, where the Accompanion follows behind, and in London, they are following behind just as these sources say to do. But in Amsterdam, the Accompanion has a different function entirely. They're not following behind the Torah. They're leading the Torah and making sure no one's in the way of the Torah. And that is a different function completely. And so none of these sources would account for the minhag in Amsterdam. That's not, their function is not to follow behind, unless it's something more akin to a Sigan, who is supposed to walk with it. And maybe that is the same idea, I'm not sure. But it's not a matter of your physical space, it's a matter of being available to attend to the needs of the Sefer Torah, and not as much about following behind it as it passes. There's more that could be said, but I've kept you long enough, longer than I expected. So I'm going to end the recording here and wish you all a good evening, and hope that you enjoyed.